Welcome to the second episode of Hopefully Interesting, but what we're calling episode one because we don't like to be confusing or anything.
Right.
Hopefully, you thought episode zero, our pilot, was interesting. Hopefully, you are going to find some of the things we talk about in this episode interesting. And you may have noticed from the first episode that Mark and I have a hard time staying on topic. So, you'll either think that's endearing or
Hor-
other thoughts on it, right? Um, so this week we're going to talk about maintaining your gear. Well, not gear so much, but maintaining your weapons. Be them lightsabers or steel swords for HEMA or at the SCA. And as somebody who just got my first steel swords, we're going to defer to Mark so he can kind of give us a primer on what you want to do and how you want to take care of your lovely, lovely babies.
Right. And so this is also going to apply more than just martial arts training tools. You can apply this to if you have a machete or an axe that you take camping, or you have a wall hanger that's gathered some rust. So this shouldn't apply to antique weapons, though. If you're looking at restoring an antique, I recommend you go check out a different channel, different video, because unless you're dealing with the same issues, then you're probably going to be handling them in a very different way, as you want to preserve the shape and the quality of the object as well, for collecting and such. But we're going to start things off with an axe that I have laying around. This is everything we're going to be talking about is going to be some kind of high carbon steel. Not really going to get into the numbers because I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but it's going to be a carbon based steel. For stainless steel, I do have a couple of those. It's kind of a different process, but realistically, unless you're doing something crazy with it, a stainless steel sword should never really have issues. It definitely won't rust, and if it tarnishes, you can wipe it down with a jeweler's rag or something, and it'll be fine. Um, but yeah, so starting off with this, it's an example I've had for some time. The edge isn't too bad, but if you notice, I don't know if the camera picks up the color difference. There's quite a bit of rust buildup along the outside of it here, and some light rusting on this blackened piece here, right both behind the edge. So this is what I would consider a bit more aggressive without getting into having to go to a power tool or heavy chemicals. Anything more than this, that's probably going to be your answer. You're looking at a steel wheel on a buffing tool of whatever kind, and you're looking at much more abrasive options. So starting with this, though, you're going to be looking at, you want to get a sandpaper. How much rust you have will determine how high or low of a grit you need. If you have a lot more rust buildup, then you're going to want to start at something like an 80, or potentially lower. Although you really should be using a steel wheel at that point. Just a little bit on what a steel wheel is. It's steel wires in a wheel, spins around real fast, and use that to grind off rust and paint and things like that. So with this, obviously, you're just going to start sanding down the edges. And if you use the right grit of sandpaper, I'm just going to do one spot real quick. With a little bit of sanding, I don't know if you can tell the difference, but
Little bit.
okay. So it's sanded up here. It's not sanded down here. So a little bit of sanding, you're going to take off that surface rust. I would say if you err on the side of higher grit rather than a lower grit, because the lower grit is obviously has bigger sand particles and is going to be more scratch up your sword more or
So
whatever you're working on.
remove more material, essentially.
Right. And so on that, another great option are these called sanding blocks or sanding sponges. It's what the name suggests. It's sandpaper glued to a sponge. Nice part about this is, as we'll see in a second with the other examples, it follows the curvature. So against the axe blade there, if you press in against it, it's going to hug that contour and you're not going to change the shape as much. It's not so great for these like real hard areas here, hard meaning the hard edges, because if I try and grind that down with a sanding sponge, it's going to destroy the sanding sponge. So you want to use something like sandpaper. Fortunately, sanding blocks are real cheap and they come in lots of varieties. Here's another one. This one specifically is 400 and 600 grit, so we'll be getting to that in a second. But then you're going to look at something like this. This is more what people are going to be seeing on most of their training tools, training examples, training weapons. But yeah, so it's going to be surface rust. I can feel it. There's no real particles protruding out. So we're going to look at using something slightly different. We could start with the sandpaper. Again, you want to go with something of relatively fine grit. So I'm going to sand one side real quick. And you can kind of see the difference there. So that's the side I sanded. And that's what it looked like before. Okay. So a little bit of sanding goes a long way. Don't overdo it. If it still has spots on it, don't worry too much about it. Because if you worry about those spots, then you're taking down an entire level of metal. So if you imagine it like an onion, if you poke a hole in the outside shell of an onion, you have to, in order to get everything back to the same size, you have to strip off an entire layer of the onion. So if I were to grind it all the way down to take off that rust, I'd be taking off, a few thousandth of a millimeter or whatever the case might be. I'm going to take off a portion of that blade in order to get it back down to that size.
So what you're saying is, much like ogres, swords are also like onions and have layers.
Yes.
All right. So you kind of touched on it. There is a point where you just can't take the blemishes off, or you can't restore the sword without risking, I don't know if quality, safety, creating a safety risk by playing with your sword. Is there a point where you just have to go, shoot, I guess I have to buy a new blade?
Yeah, but most people will never see that with their training tools. More what that is if you found your great grandpa's World War I saber in a barn and it's been in the barn in a humid environment for 100 years, then definitely you should not be using that. Maybe some like cutting fruit, but that's about the limit of what you'd want to do with it. Obviously, at that point, you're not sparring with it anyway. But there are the examples of like the Victorian era gymnasium sabers. And fortunately, a lot of those were kept in a fairly good condition. And so we have a lot of surviving examples. But those, depending on the surface rust, if it's tarnished, because rusting is oxidization, and you can think of it in the same way like copper gets a patina, or brass gets a patina, and they'll turn like greens and blues and different colors. Black, silver turns black. So it's all the same idea. So it depends mostly though on how far the rust goes into the metal. If I strip off, a thousandth of an inch, maybe, is it really going to affect it? No. You are going to change the point of balance if you, depending on how much metal you take off, you're going to change possibly the flexibility. If I had, so full length blade here, if I had a really bad rust spot dead in the middle, then maybe that would change the flexibility of it, right? Where now this point of the blade flexes more than the ending third or so where it should be flexing. And that could cause a safety issue because it'll be more prone to snapping. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, and I was going to say, we should also preface this. I maybe should have hit on it at the beginning. Like I said, I'm relatively new to HEMA. Been going very sparingly over the course of 2-ish years. Started getting more interested within the last year. Most recently, bought my steel swords and they showed up, which is what gave me the idea to do this episode today. And on Mark, he's been studying much longer than I am. Has collected swords and weapons and stuff before and is knowledgeable on steel from the aspect of he has worked on firearms. So when he's talking about taking care of steel and stuff like that, that is where his experience comes from. Just so hopefully you don't think, since maybe you don't recognize our names from HEMA circles, that you don't think we've just done a little bit of research and are mostly talking out our butts.
Right. Yeah, to hit on that, I worked on firearms for 4 years in the Marine Corps, and I got my first sword or sword-like object, because it was a wall hanger, when I was 9 or so. I got my first real steel sword at about 15, 16. So I haven't been at this as long as some people, but I do know a fair bit. Or at least I like to think so. Swords are obviously a lot different than firearms. But in terms of steel, not so much. The only difference is with firearms, you're more particular. So what I would consider surface rust on a sword might be on a firearm. It might be something that I would want to either replace those parts or just stick it on a shelf and it's effectively a dead gun. So because you're dealing with a lot higher pressures and things like that, it can be a lot more dangerous to have a rusted firearm than a rusted sword. On the note of training weapons, you can affect the flexibility, you can affect the point of balance. Really, like I said, though, unless it's something that's been sitting in a barn for a century, or, maybe you live in a really humid environment, then you should be considering some of the options that we're going to be talking about after we've gone over general care. But we'll hit on those in a second. But yeah, I wouldn't say it'd be something anyone would really have to worry about who's doing just general HEMA, general AEDA, because they use swords as well, steel swords, general SCA type stuff. If you submerge your sword in a bucket of water and leave it there for a month or two, you're going to have a rusted mess, but you shouldn't do that anyway. So just general wear and tear, I don't really think it'd be an issue. And especially if you're staying away from power tools. Where I would say it'd be an issue is if you're new to power tools, you're new to like belt sanders, you hop on a belt sander with 80 grit or so, and you lean into it and or a grinder, for example, like you use for blacksmithing, and you lean into it, you can take chunks out of steel. And that's where I would see that being an issue. As far as what the rust does, not really.
So you talked about the axe.
Yep.
You talked about the blade.
Right. And so the next thing, moving down the list. So like I said, you'd want to sand off the rust. I'm obviously going to be finishing out all these projects later and oiling them down, so I don't really care about touching the blade. It's not going to rust in the hour or so it takes me to get to those things. The next thing, this is a Darkwood Armory blade. Brand doesn't really matter. What we're looking at though is it is still shiny, but it's well used, and it's going to have a surface tarnish, if you will. It starts to have a brownish reflection. So when you're looking at steel, especially shiny steel like this is, you're generally going to have, if it's clean, a bluish reflection or a clear reflection like a mirror. You notice though that just sitting in a humid environment, or somewhat humid environment or dirty environment like my garage, it's going to start reflecting almost a brownish color, which pretty sure won't pick up on camera. But if you look at like an old file like I've got here, it starts to get like a brownish color to it. And that's from the immediate surface layer starting to rust. And all you're going to want to do with that, if it's a bad tarnish, you can go for a higher grit steel wool. But this is quadruple lot, I think, steel wool. You can get this at most home hardware stores. You can get it pretty much anywhere. Most grocery stores will have it for cleaning dishes and pots and pans and stuff as well. You don't want. What's up?
By quadruple, do you mean it's essentially a 400 grit?
No. So 400 grit is still, that's going to be, you're still talking about sandpaper. A 400 grit kind of feels like a chalkboard almost. Would be a good way of explaining that. But steel wool, and I'll rip off a piece there. Steel wool is just wool, or feels like wool to most people, but it's made out of a steel fiber. And so the way they talk about steel wool is in aughts or zeros. So quadruple aught is 4 zeros. I believe you can get a 1 and a 2 for steel wool, but that's going to be more rare. A 0 or a double aught is going to be equivalent to like the scouring pad on the back of a sponge, which is also a valid option. Like you can use Scotch-Brite or the green surface on the back of a sponge, or blue or whatever color it is, just that scrubbing portion of it. Quadruple aught is more of a polishing. We're getting into the range of polishing rather than actually taking off any material. We're more smoothing material when we get to this. So I'll just do the base of it here. We'll see if we can see a difference on camera with this one, but just nice and quick. So about this section is about where I was cleaning, and it starts to get a little fuzzier up here, a little foggier, I would say. Not sure how well that's going to show up on camera, but if you do it for yourself, you can really notice a difference. But that's going to take the surface tarnish off of it, so bring it back to a nice and shiny color. You can go more aggressive or less aggressive. A lot of training weapons are going to develop scratches and dings and things like that. So we're mostly concerned with just making sure that it doesn't rust rather than trying to restore it to factory settings. Because like we were talking about with the previous blade, if you're taking off that much material every time you're cleaning it to restore it to factory, then eventually you're going to have no sword left. Obviously that's drastic, but Another good option for that kind of thing, if you're used to sharpening swords, so for sharps or just for cutting in your backyard or whatever, you can get one of these. This is a stone. These come in different variety. This was originally an orange stone, and that means it's essentially a higher grit than a white stone, but it's essentially the same idea of a whetstone. Now, with whetstones, you do want to use oil. If you have it, water works, but oil is going to give you a better result. It's not just for sharpening, but you can use it on the side of your blade too to remove rust or tarnish. It's going to be more aggressive than the steel wool, but less aggressive than sandpaper generally. I would equate an orange one to roughly about 1,000 grit sandpaper. But yeah. And then moving on to the next one. This one this is my general training blade for right now, for rapier at least. So it's not terribly dinged up. It is a relatively new blade. It's also not terribly tarnished. So what I'm going to do real quick and show, because Joe was asking about this before, and I'm sure some other people have similar questions, especially if you're a collector and you don't have a club, or you're looking into swords and you haven't gone out and sparred a lot, or don't have other people you can ask questions to. So I'm going to use 3-in-1 oil made by, I'm not really sure. It's made by WD-40. So WD-40 is itself is a penetrating oil. And so that's going to be a little more abrasive to the metal. You can use it for preserving your blades in a pinch, but it's more meant for breaking down metal and breaking down rust rather than general prevention, although it's pretty good at that as well. This is also going to be a little easier to control, generally cheaper because it comes in a non-aerosol, and it's going to be less toxic for the wood. So this, if you can see, I made this a nice wooden handle a while back. But oil in itself is really bad, or the kind of oil you would be using for maintaining a blade or a guard or whatever the case might be, is going to be really bad for wood, really bad for oil, or really bad for leather. So what you're going to do is I'm just using a paper towel. You can use a reusable towel, whatever you want, preferably not your bath towel, but whatever floats your boat. You're going to take about a $50 size, half US dollar size, or about a teaspoon. Really, it's going to vary depending on the size of your blade, how absorbent your cloth is, things like that. But you want to build a nice surface layer, just as thin as you can get it, without missing any parts. So you're just going to pour that right onto the cloth. And now what I like to do is let that soak in, and then we're going to fold it in half, and we're just going to run that along the blade a couple times. Now, running it along the blade will also clean it, and I'm pinching firmly. I'm not really trying to scrub it, but you want to pinch it firmly and run it up and down the blade. And that way you also get off any gunk, had some surface gunk on it, just from dust, Could be sitting in your gear bag, could be in your garage or your entryway. It's going to collect dust, especially if it's coated with oil. And so when you're done, you shouldn't really, it should look glossy, but it shouldn't look wet, is how I describe it to most people. And if you're in a relatively dry environment, you could leave that for months, maybe even years, and really shouldn't have an issue. If you're in a humid environment, you might want to do that once a week, twice a week. If you're in a neutral environment, then just keep an eye on it. If it starts going brown or if it starts building up rust, gotta clean it.
So, you talked about that. What about like one of mine that I just got? Your top part of your hilt, your
Mm-hmm.
cup, that Poppenheimer part, that
Mm-hmm.
looked a different shade. Is that something
Yep.
you did to it? And would
Yeah.
you have to treat yours still, or would I have? I guess would I have to treat mine because it's still exposed steel, and is yours a different color because something you did to it to help preserve it?
Yes. So to answer the first part of your question on whether or not you'll have to do it to yours, yes. You have to oil all of the exposed steel
Okay.
because it'll all rust. Now, there are, I believe, the Hanway blades, I believe, are made with stainless steel guard. And also Zen Warrior, since we're talking about rapiers. Zen Warrior makes their guards out of stainless steel, so that doesn't stand for that. However, any carbon steel will rust. Any mild steel will rust. Any cast iron or iron in general will rust, unless it's like stainless steel where it has a chemical coating, essentially, if you want to think about it that way. But yeah, so this is something that I did as an experiment a while ago, trying to take the glare from the blade off of it. So this is oil bluing. And the idea with that is you heat it up to a decent temperature. There's plenty of videos out there that'll explain it better than I have, or I'm going to because I've done it all at once. But it's you heat it up to a nice blue color. The steel will actually turn blue or purple, and then you quench it in oil. I just used motor oil. It is an option if you're experienced with blacksmithing. It's not a bad option. I would not recommend anyone to try it on a sword for the first time, or I mean a guard for the first time, because that was very difficult, and if you look at it, didn't exactly turn out great. But the one thing you want to make sure never to do is do that to your blade, because you'll destroy your temper. Because brief overview of what the temper is, it's basically getting the steel to align a certain way because you've released pressure on it, and the atomic structure is going to want to realign itself to its crystalline form. And so when you heat it up, it allows the molecules to reform into their easiest bonds. And then I might be getting that backwards with something. But either way, then you quench it and it locks them into that structure.
Okay.
But if you then go, you have to stick it in an oven essentially and bring it back up to a lesser degree. And that's what kind of gives it its springiness and gives it its rigidity and flexibility, but it also makes sure that it's not brittle or anything like that. So if you heat up your blade, it's going to mess with the temper and the structure of that. And for example, like Castile Armory goes to great lengths to make sure that when their blades break, they break flat, so it's not going to give you a jagged point. A lot of manufacturers do that, but they're widely known for it. And if you were to try and blacken that blade, it's going to destroy it. Now, I am getting a Castile Armory fetter blade blank. I actually got a blank from them instead of a finished blade, and a cross guard from them. They're 10-inch Quailons. And then I'm getting in also a pommel from a different manufacturer. So I'm going to be trying to blue those as well. But it is an option. My recommendation, though, is make friends with a blacksmith and have them do it, because it's rough. But yeah, any carbon steel you're going to have to treat in some way.
Okay. And then you were talking about with the leather, to
Right.
not get oil on the leather. Is this something that you would recommend be taken apart prior to oiling, or is this something you could maybe get away with leaving intact with a proper amount of care, or is it just good practice to take something apart?
I mean, that's really up to you. Anytime you take it apart and put it back together, wood naturally expands and contracts due to humidity and due to temperature. So it might not fit perfectly if you do that too many times. But as long as you're not putting too much oil on your blade, you should be fine.
Okay.
If you take your blade and you just spray it down with an aerosol like WD-40, so it's dripping wet, and then you have my blade off camera here, and then you store it with the tip up, that's going to let all of that oil drain into the wood, which will destroy it over time. If you're going to do long-term storage, then maybe, yeah,
Okay.
you can take it apart.
Okay. And then, while rapiers have generally more complicated guards like yours, with more fancy bits to it, my cup hilt rapier is fairly simple. But then you look at something like the saber I got in, and it's not
Right.
doesn't look too intimidating till you start to turn it, and then you see this piece of metal for the backstrap. Now, I'm assuming, again, we could take this apart to minimize getting the wood underneath this leather, or getting oil on this, or with a proper amount of care, we could probably just wipe this down, hit here, and again, being very careful. We could take it apart because there is more metal touching our leather, which is hiding our wood, right? Sometimes you kind of have to look at the hilt and I guess evaluate what's the best way to clean/maintain them.
Yeah, exactly. With general use for a saber like that, if you're sparring with it on a weekly basis, if you're hitting a pel or punching bag with it on a daily or weekly basis, you're pretty much going to self-clean that backstrap with your gloves. It's going to wear down any rust or anything that might be on the surface.
Okay.
If you are planning on storing it long term, then think about you can really you can take it apart and soak everything in oil, not actually soak it like in a bath, but give it a nice coating. You could also get they make grease especially for storage of steel for long term, and that grease is going to build an actual surface, a second skin around the sword for a long period of time. But you want to make sure you really clean that off when you get it back, or when you decide to start using it again. That's essentially the same as the packing grease that companies will coat their sword with and then send it to you. It's generally a much thicker grease. that is really bad for your skin, really bad to eat. Unfortunately, you get particles on your fingers. You might not wash your hands before you go eat, or it might get on something or whatever. It's really nasty to ingest. It's really nasty to let it soak into your skin. So you want to make sure you clean that real good when you get it from a company. And also you could put the same kind of grease back on it if you're going to store it in like a garage for a year or two. Let's say you moved and you're not into HEMA right now or SCA or what have you. You can do it to your armor, your swords, whatever, like a lithium grease, like a nice thick grease, to really build a second skin on it.
Right. And that's part why I was handling the blade while wearing a glove, because I have not had a chance to clean that grease off of mine. I've
Right.
ordered some oil at Mark's suggestion to
Yep.
oil my blades and get them squared away in that aspect, but they're off
Mhm.
camera on a towel right now, so it doesn't seep into the couch that I'm sitting in. I'm trying to minimize getting that grease on anything, like Mark said. It's
It's
not
nasty.
great stuff. Yeah, it's industrial stuff. It's not meant for humans, and it's not meant for a lot of things. So
Right.
and again, I'm probably being extra cautious, but unlike Mark, who has the grease in hand and can maintain his swords from touching them, by the time
Hmm.
my stuff gets here from Amazon, probably next week, it probably won't kill my sword that my hands are touching, especially that they have the grease on them. But I'm just trying to take care of myself mostly by using the glove and prolong the life of swords, because training swords aren't always
Are
cheap.
expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely. And on the note of oil, um, you can get. I obviously am using 3-in-1 oil because I also use that as cutting fluid for milling. I use that for all sorts of stuff. But and so I have it on hand. I would also, if you're going to go out and buy oil, Rem oil is great. It's made by Remington. It's probably one of the best oils for preserving guns or swords or other high carbon objects. Um, there are some solutions that are made specifically for swords. I know Purple Heart Armory sells some. I believe Hanway makes their own. I believe Cold Steel makes their own, although I'm not sure. But you can Google it. As long as you have some kind of oil that prevents rust, in a real bad pinch, like you move to the middle of nowhere and you don't have any access to anything and you can't just order something online, vegetable oil would work. But at that point, it's maybe time to rethink some life choices for swords. But um, everything's kind of falling over here. But yeah, no, you can use really just about any kind of oil to do it in a pinch. Like if you're going to like if you're traveling, going to a tournament or something, and you forget your oil and you're at in a humid environment, you could potentially use like vegetable oil or something.
Or you even said WD-40 is good in a pinch, right? Again,
Mm-hmm.
not optimum, but it's
Right.
something I can
Right.
use.
Yeah.
So one other thing we didn't quite touch on. You mentioned burrs or nicks in blades.
Right.
How would somebody file those off? And while filing those off, is there any risk to potentially putting an edge on your training sword?
Yeah. So the first thing you're going to want to do. So this is my dagger. And it's a paring dagger for when I do rapier. And so you notice it's got some dings, it's got some burrs along it, which aren't so good to potentially make contact with someone. So the first thing you're going to do is you want to get one of these. You can find they come with knife sets. You can get or kitchen knife sets. You can get them pretty much at any grocery store that sells kitchen knives. It's I'm not sure of the actual name of it. Should look that up.
I think it's a steel.
Yeah, I think it's just a steel. But what these are designed to do is, so if you imagine you have your blade, right? And then when you get a burr, essentially what you've got is, a piece of metal is off to one side, right? So what these are made to do is just push it back in line. These are not actually for sharpening. They're for pushing the edge back in. And so the reason they come with kitchen knife sets is because when you're cutting on a cutting board or chopping or whatever, you're flattening out the blade. You're not really taking away chunks of the blade, but you're pushing the material up into it, which essentially mushrooms the edge. And so you use the steel to recorrect that edge and bring it back to a nice point. So the first thing we're going to do is take it and start to run it along until it feels nice and smooth. And this could take a while, so I'm not going to do it all the way on camera, but you get the idea. But you're bringing it back in line. You're forcing that steel back to where it should be. And then after that, you'll want to take something like a file. Now this is it's a larger rasp. You could also use sandpaper. I'll do that in a second. But I like to start off the edge this way. Now it's very important that you file perpendicular to the edge. Now this is obviously for training swords, not for sharp swords. But you want to take that file, and remember, files only cut in one way unless you get special files. So you don't want to, on most files, you don't want to pull back, or else that'll just dull the file and make everything harder. But you file it, which will give you a nice flat edge to work on, a nice flat countertop, or however you want to think about it. And so now, like, I can feel some burrs, but really pressing into it, it's not going to do any damage. After that, it's important so we've essentially taken, our messed up edge, and we've pushed those pieces back in line, and now we've flattened out the table. Well, we don't want this section, because this in here, this 90-degree angle, or whatever degree, is still a sharp edge. So if we take a sanding sponge, now this is an 80 grit sanding sponge, you could use whatever you want. But then again, perpendicular, we're going to press that into the edge. I recommend getting a cheap sanding sponge because they can get expensive. And this is destroying the sanding sponge because not what it was intended for, really. But what this is going to give us is, as the sanding sponge, as we press into the sanding sponge, you can see it a little bit better on this one, we're pressing into it, and so it creates a nice bevel for us. And so we're taking that flat edge, and by pressing in the sanding sponge, we're going to give it a little bit more like that kind of edge. So there's no real sharp corners on it. And it's something you have to sit with for a while. Now, the most important part with this stuff is you do not take your file or your stone or whatever you're using and go along the side like I was doing with the steel. If you go along the side, you're sharpening your blade. And while it might not be sharp enough to cut paper or skin or whatever, it's definitely not sharp. It is going to be sharp enough to, if you really give your opponent a blow, it's going to be sharp enough to cut into them, potentially to split open their jacket, depending on how much you do it. It is very, very important that you do not sharpen your training tool. I've seen it done before. Joe's seen it done before. And we're not going to mention any names, but it's very important that this be nice and flat at very least. We do not want to sharpen it.
Right. And I mean, once or twice you do something like that, I would imagine it's not enough to give it that edge. But let's say your blade lasts you 2, 3 years. You're
Right.
constantly removing the burrs and stuff in your blade by going this way and then back this way, and you're building up that point slowly. So maybe
Right.
not your first, third, fourth, or fifth time doing that, but if you're practicing weekly and you're removing those burrs on a regular basis, eventually you'll make that some point of that edge pretty fine. And that's
Right.
not great.
Yeah. Coincidentally, this can also be done if you get a training sword of whatever type for the first time, and you're not happy with how thick or thin the edge is. I always recommend going thicker rather than thinner, because you can always, like, if you have a thicker edge, then it disperses the impact over a wider surface area. The more narrow the surface area, the more cutting you get, essentially. And so I would never recommend thinning your blade, but you can definitely thicken your blade. Like this dagger is one of the old Zen Warrior daggers. And I love my Zen Warrior stuff, but when I got this, the edge up here at the point, now granted, most of that's covered in tape, but the edge up here at the point is actually relatively narrow compared to down here or even the sides of my rapier. And while I'm probably not going to be hitting people with my dagger, it's Joe's having some technical difficulties. I'm probably not going to be hitting people with the edge of my dagger, but it's still important because it might happen. It's like I tell people with their gear. We don't wear a fencing helmet because our opponent is trying to hurt us. We wear it because they hit hard or they have accidents or whatever the case might be.
I would say mostly it's in the case of accidents, right? Like you
You
are
would think.
ideally fencing or sparring or training with somebody with a certain degree of control, and we wear the gear hopefully to prevent any accidents from happening,
Right.
and accidental injuries.
Right. And that, I mean, not to say you can't hit your opponent, because obviously that's the point. And any amount of contact with a steel bar is not going to feel good. But there's definitely some people out there who feel like they need to swing the sword like like they're clubbing baby seals in order for it to do anything. And that's not how that works.
Or they're in the home run derby, and
they're in the home run derby.
Yeah.
Same with the lightsaber group. Same with everything else. You always find those people who feel like they need to swing for the fences in order to accomplish anything, when in reality they just need to work on their technique.
So, I think we got all of our points on steel trainers potentially, right?
There's one more.
Okay.
One more. So this is another option for steel trainers. Obviously, do not do this to an antique. It's another option for steel trainers, and that is painting your blade. Now, it was done historically, especially for naval cutlasses, for just naval weapons in general. It's not as prevalent, especially in like the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, but it was done. It is an option. The paint will get chipped off. You can just paint it with a rust-proof Rust-Oleum brand spray paint. I think that's what I used on this. Black or whatever color you want, in all honesty. It will prevent rust buildup, but it does need to be pretty much reapplied after every sparring session. check with your club of whether or not they're going to allow it. Check with your tournaments before you go to see if they're willing to allow it as well. And remember, if you're doing SCA stuff, they are going to require a differently colored tip. So if I paint my blade black, then I'm going to need to cover the tip in, as this example goes, a white grip tape or electrical tape,
Something
because
contrast.
because it contrasts with a black blade. If I used black electrical tape on a black blade, that'd be bad, because then they wouldn't be able to see it.
Now, would painting the steel parts, whether the blade or the guard, would that be another option for long-term storage?
Yes. However, the issue with that is it's a pain to remove. So it's not like grease where you're going to just coat it in grease, sit in a closet, pick it up, spend an hour re-cleaning it or however long, and then be right back ready to use as if it was brand new. I would say you shouldn't paint your blade or paint your guard if you ever want it to be the original color and finish. When I got that blade originally, it was black. And I had to take it to a steel wheel and spend a couple hours grinding off paint and whatever else is on there. You could use some nasty chemicals out there like acetone in order to remove the paint, but it's never really going to be the same as it was before. So, but if you're cool with that, then go for it. So, and especially if you're doing like historical reenactments or things like along that nature, where you're portraying a 1600s, 1700s, 1800s sailor, and you want to carry a cutlass, maybe that'd be a good option. But do your research on that.
Okay. One more sword tip?
One more sword. So this is the last one, or last sword, I guess. So this is my sharp that I actually was cutting water bottles with today. I did wipe down the blade afterward, made sure it's all clean and free of water, because water rusts steel really badly. This also has a leather washer. The leather on this part will degrade rather quickly, and that's going to be really bad in the long run with the oil, but it's a little piece of leather. You can cut out a new one and just shove it on there. But what I wanted to talk about with this one specifically is storage of sharps in steel scabbards is horrible, because every time you pull it out of the scabbard or put it into the scabbard, you're going to dull it. In addition to that, it doesn't do anything for you as far as wicking or removing water like a wood-lined scabbard might. Not to say that that will prevent your sword from rusting. It still will, but it's going to help in some ways. But the main thing I wanted to hit on was the brass. Now, what you can do with the brass, you can actually still oil the brass like you would with a steel blade or steel fixtures on a saber. Brass does tarnish a lot easier than steel. But what you can do is, again, coming back to that quadruple lot steel wool, give everything a nice little scrub down just to remove any surface patina, and especially from handling it is, or in my case, getting spray paint on it when I leave it in my garage for too long. So you give that a nice scrub down, then you can put oil on it, you can put wax on it. Another option, once you're done with the steel wool, is going to be something like this. This is actually for a magnesium and aluminum, but it's a polishing compound. It's going to look like something like that, like a paste, kind of like a like a hair gel or something like that. And you put a little dab of that on a cloth. You scrub down the aluminum, and it'll bring back the polish. It'll also remove any tarnish or anything like that you got going on. So that is definitely an option.
All right. And lastly, so we covered steel, and we said we'd mention lightsabers. Lightsabers, a little easier to take care of. Aluminum
Yeah,
doesn't really rust, or if it, it doesn't tarnish quite as easily as steel does. Um, so we've got different hilts from different manufacturers. The only thing on this one I would probably ever worry about getting messed up would be the leather wrap. Um,
right.
and so you've got fancy things like blade plugs. Obviously, if I can find them around here, depending on how you have your lightsaber wired up, you either have the way they came, which is with the AAAs normally, is what are in them,
It depends on the manufacturer.
or you've
Um,
got the rechargeable batteries. I like to keep mine in one of these because in a black bag, something obnoxiously orange is easy to find. Um, and for maintaining them, aside from potentially doing wiring, I don't think there's too
right.
much we need to worry about, and cutting
It
blades and stuff
depends.
like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it really just depends on how you want your saber to look. Um, so for me personally, I don't, other than electronics, I don't really maintain them. I do make sabers actually, but I don't really maintain my own because I see them as tools for training, and I don't really care what they look like. But so as far as the polycarbonate goes, as you can see, this one gets some like scuffs, something like that.
Right. I got
A
a
lot of
bad
these,
scuff one too.
yeah, a lot of these are going to be from impact with painted objects like gear or masks or things like that. Um, and then the other thing you're going to get is really bad dings. Um, so if you can see that, it's getting pretty chewed up.
Yeah.
Um,
You can tell some parts
so
on my Ronin as well, where like the black paint on there has gotten
yeah.
knocked
Um,
off.
so for the polycarbonate though, if all you have is the scuffs, the black marks, and the stuff like a red or whatever color they end up being, you can use a magic eraser by Mr. Clean or Mr. Clean brand magic eraser, and that does really well to remove a lot of those. You can also use a like toothpaste on a paper towel, something like that. I just go straight for the sandpaper, which is also going to remove a lot of the surface scuffing marks. Again, like I was talking about with the blades, though, you don't want to sand these down too much, or else you're thinning out the material, which can be a safety issue or just a longevity issue with these. But yeah, just this is a 80 grit, and you can see where that scuff mark was, and now the scuff mark is gone.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
easy as that. It's really simple to sand these.
I've even heard some people in like choreography groups when they practice and they're practicing in their costumes or what have you, and they get the scuff marks. I've heard of some
Mm-hmm.
people even using like Goo Gone on a rag
Yeah,
and using that to remove the stuff. Um,
yeah.
and
Um,
obviously, um, oh, you have your shorty out. Yeah, I was gonna say obviously for TSL purposes, which is the organization both Mark and I are in. I have my Ronin, which is 16 inches. I like my
I have.
sabers in the flavor of rechargeable batteries. So whether or not they came that way, I've learned a basic wiring or had people do wiring for me, and I
Nope.
have a nice part in there for I can put a rechargeable. And I have multiples because batteries die, and you fight with glow sticks because they light up and they're fun.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And like another option is kill keys, like in this one,
Yep.
which is a recharge port as well. Um,
Yeah. Another one that you made me, and I've got that
yep,
same kill key. And like Mark was saying, you pull it out, and it turns on, and
yep,
then you pop it back in, turns it off.
yeah. And so having a kill key allows you to not have to mess with the electronics as much, which can increase the longevity of the saber. Um, but in terms of the outside, um, obviously, so with the brass, you're going to treat the brass the same way I was talking about with the saber hilt, the heavy saber hilt. Um, this one has got some more green on it because it lives out in my car for the most part. Um, but you can, another option that I wouldn't necessarily recommend with the sabers, but you could do theoretically on lightsabers, is you can actually clear coat them. Um, you could like tape off the leather on the handle and then spray it down with like a enamel or acrylic clear coat to prevent it from tarnishing. That's more of an option if you're going to be leaving it on a shelf like most people do for a long period of time. But we're talking about more for fighting.
Yeah.
Um, so something like this one, you can see the aluminum up here is getting really chewed up. Again, that's because I frankly don't care what they look like. They're training tools. But, and unlike steel, if I let this tarnish, it will never fade away. But you can definitely take your 80 grit sanding sponge, you can take, your file, you can go around and clean that up. Again, some of these deeper nicks and gouges, not so much. Um, for example, this one,
Yeah.
um, like that's a nice meaty one. Um, Also, Subas take a beating. Probably not going to have much luck cleaning those up.
I don't know if you can see it here because this one's fairly shiny. Yeah, you can see some of the
Yeah,
scrapes and some of the damage or the nicks
yeah,
up in here on this one.
right.
And I think they show a little more on something that like this, which you did for me, where it's got a little more of a polish. It's going to be a
Yeah,
little less forgiving to the scuffs to the flatter, less shiny finished one that you made me.
right. Yeah, exactly. It really depends on your finish. The higher the polish, the more likely you are to see imperfections. Um, yeah. So that's a brushed finish that I did. You can also, again, you can go over it with steel will or sorry, a sanding sponge to really knock down those higher points to kind of keep it from getting sharp. Steel will almost always get sharper burrs than aluminum, but it is an option. Another option, again, the steel will to it's more of a polishing thing, like I said before, than a than actually cleaning it up, but it works. And also the polishing compounds. Now I mentioned the magnesium and aluminum one before. They make steel. They make steel compounds. They make brass compounds. They make silver, gold, whatever you're polishing. You should go find the polishing compound to match, because it's going to be either a finer compound or a more coarse compound. It's also going to not have anything inside the polishing compound that will react poorly with the metal that you're polishing.
And
Um,
again, like Mark was saying, benefits to kill keys are you futz with your electronics. You're not pulling out a sled, or you're not pulling out your chassis or the thing with the four AAA's, the battery pack. Um, you just plug it into that spot where the kill key goes. You charge it, so it's less tension moving those wires back and forth. Another benefit with them is most of them, well, some of them, with the kill keys in them, just pulling the kill key out
Mhm.
turns your saber on, so you don't have to worry about, ooh, I'm fighting, and somebody's saber hits my button, and I, in the middle of a fight, get to go, oh no, my lightsaber's turned off. And
Right.
when you're fighting, I say the Saber Legion or TSL because that's the group I am the um, most active in. But I do fight with some other groups down here in Southern California, like the Lightspeed Saber League occasionally. And because they allow shorter hilts, that's my daily driver when I fight in that league. Um, that's a benefit to kill keys, is they don't get turned off in the middle of combat. Part of your essential kit, whether you use the, what are they, the 18650 rechargeables, right?
Yep.
Um,
Or 14500.
right. Keeping some of those on you, or AAAs if your saber uses that. Good thing to keep on you is also an Allen wrench. Most people should have those.
Right.
You can keep a Allen wrench like that, um, which gets lost easy. And again, I don't like
Oh
to
yeah.
lose things. So I have, again,
I buy
when I
them in
knock,
packs of 10.
I just bought one of these. Again, kind of a yellow color, a little bit harder to lose in the bag.
Hmm.
And that's when I use most of the time. And you can tell when it's closed in there because I pull for it the most. You can't tell on the camera, but it's bent a little because I reach for it so much. When you're talking about 1 inch diameter blades, Lightspeed uses a thinner diameter, but any group with a 1 inch diameter, keeping one of these in your bag is generally nice in case blade breaks happen, or in case you have a new blade that you forgot to cut down before a tournament. Because, like any sword group, it's really sucky to show up and then be told your stuff's not quite right. We hope you can find a friend to borrow something from. So
Right.
always be prepared. And so for any lightsaber group, TSL or groups that 1 inch use 1 inch blades specifically, say keep one of these in your bags, keep extra batteries, and
Yep.
keep an Allen key. It's good practice.
A lot easier than showing up to a rapier tournament and being told your blade's too long.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah, that would suck. But yeah, I mean, just general care of it. Now, I will say that no matter how much you baby your electronics, all electronics will break. Most hilts will break. Um, it's just par for the course. Blade breaks happen a lot more in with fighting with the LED sabers than they do with fighting with steel, or at
yeah,
least they
thankfully
should
they're
be.
yeah, and thankfully they're a lot cheaper to replace.
Right. If
Um,
you go through a store like the Custom Saber Shop, a blade's going to run you like $15. So,
yeah, or if you do what I did, which I think I got this one from, I think I got this one from Kyber Light when they were on sale. I think they were $20 blades, but they were a buy
right.
one get one sale.
Yeah.
So they wound up being $10 a piece. Plus, they were doing like a Fourth of July sale, so there was a extra discount on top of that. I did not email them that I wanted a round tip instead of a bullet tip, so I went and liberal amount of force and sandpaper applied to the tip. I know some people like them because they screw on, and because they screw on so much. Apologize for the
Nice long thread.
squeaking. Right. So a little less likely to get your sabers popping off. Could you glue them?
Right.
Maybe, but as glue expands, you might put a crack in that part
Right.
in your blade right there. So um, normally
Yeah.
what I
I
do,
am not a
um,
fan of screw on tips.
well, with the pop-on tips, normally what I do is glue them to here, let that dry, and then I like to put an amount of glue on the seam. I will then put my heat shrink on while the glue on the seam is still wet, and then I'll use the heat gun, shrink the heat shrink, and then I've kind of created almost a little bit of extra on the tip to try and reinforce it. The heat shrink's going to help your tip from flying away anyway. Um, and I
Yeah.
suppose you could do something similar here by just putting glue right on that lip and then screwing it in and getting a nice seal there. Normally with the lightsabers, I would say they either break here or they break right here. You don't get too many breaks in the middle of your blade, from my experience in watching stuff, at least.
Yeah, no, that's generally the case. Unless you're hitting like your opponent's hilt or something, you probably won't break a blade in the middle. I think the furthest I've broken a blade down the blade, aside from the first 1 or 2 inches outside of the emitter, is I've broken about here in terms of how far away it is from the tip. But yeah, they break a lot. I personally don't like the screw-on tips because it's less material around the tip, so it's less material to absorb impact with where you're generally striking. Because most lightsaber groups, I think, will agree, although maybe begrudgingly, that they hit probably 90% of the hits occur within that first inch or so from the tip. So yeah, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of them. Do check with if you're joining a lightsaber group or a HEMA group or an SCA group, make sure you're checking your regulations and you're reading your rule book and everything like that, so you can make sure that maybe your lightsaber group doesn't allow
Subas or something.
Doesn't allow stubas or screw-on tips.
Yeah.
And maybe it doesn't allow other things. Maybe like with the Saber Legion, there's a requirement for tape. Actually, heat shrink is no longer approved on its own. So there is a requirement for tape. But things like contrasting colors for the blade tip on a rapier or I believe, or longsword or whatever. Some HEMA clubs are fine with knocking everything over again. Some HEMA clubs are fine with no rubber tip on the end of your sword. Others require you to have a rubber tip on the end of all of your swords. Some it's yes on rapier, no on longsword. Just check with your local club or the tournament you plan on attending or whatever like that for those kind of answers. But yeah, I mean, that's a general breakdown of maintenance without getting too far into specific swords, which would be a good, or sabers or what have you. That'll be a topic for a different video, I think.
I think so.
Yeah. It'd be good to have a topic on how to pick your first dueling saber.
That would. And you were mentioning electronics. I think another useful thing to get would be if you don't have sound, right? And if you're comfortable doing very basic wiring, like positive to and negatives and that kind of stuff, a little like $10 to $15 soldering kit off Amazon isn't a terrible thing to get, especially if all your lightsaber is essentially a glow stick and a flashlight,
Right.
and it doesn't make the whoosh whoosh vroom sounds. It's good to have. I have a kit like this. I know Mark has a box of things he brings to tournaments because, again,
Oh yeah.
nothing sucks more than showing up and saying somebody telling you your thing doesn't work. I'm sorry, you can't play.
Right. That, and I always end up soldering someone else's saber or doing general gear fixes. And on that note as well, if you look at groups like the ACS or ACW, you pretty much have to be a low level blacksmith if you want to go to those kind of groups, the armored combat groups. So with the LED sabers, you're gonna have to learn to solder or be real good friends with someone who goes to all the same events who knows how to solder. You're going to have to know how to drill and tap a hole if you maybe strip a retention screw or something like that. Um, if you're getting into HEMA, you should know basic metalworking, things like how to use a file. You don't need to be a blacksmith, but how to use a file, how to prevent rust, how to, how to bend a blade back potentially, various things.
Yeah, and I think a trend within all of these groups could be most people are of the nerdy persuasion. Maybe
Right.
don't socialize a lot. Like Mark was saying, whatever your flavor of sword or sword shaped object combat is, read the rules, read the requirements, go to a class or a meet or tournament or whatever. Um, Talk to some people, maybe make some friends, ask them maybe, why do you use this lightsaber as opposed to this? Or why do you use a Castile rapier instead of a Darkwood? Or figure out from other people what their preference is, especially with the SCA. I know Blade Flex is a big thing. Ask those kinds of important questions before you buy something and potentially find out you can't use it, especially with steel.
Right.
Steel swords are expensive. Lightsabers can be pricey too, depending on where you buy, who you buy from.
Sometimes a lot more expensive than steel. Sometimes
Yes,
a lot cheaper than steel.
depending
So,
on what you want. And I think Mark's right. I think picking the right lightsaber for you is a topic we can definitely cover. And between him and I think we have most of the manufacturers potentially, or at least some of them.
right.
So we,
Or have handled them.
yeah,
And same with the bigger manufacturers for rapiers, even um, soon. So, yeah, and also like it's kind of in a way easier with steel because you look at the approved list of manufacturers for any big tournament like Combat Con, um, and then you can from that gauge, okay, these ones are going to be safe, these ones aren't, and then from there, it's mostly about what you want.
yeah, I would say that's really applicable to HEMA. The SCA seems at times maybe a little bit more particular because they don't require quite as much. They don't wear padded gambesons like people do in HEMA. They
Right.
require a amount of puncture resistance within the garb,
Yeah.
and for the most part, they give light and they receive light, and that's fine
In
for that style. And if that's your alley, that's awesome. Going out and doing something, I think Mark and I are always going to advocate that versus not doing anything because it gets you up and out of the house and
right.
doing sword like things, which we will advocate that all the time.
Yeah. No, definitely. If the only thing in your area is foam fighting, but you're interested in doing, ACS or ACW style armored combat, go do foam fighting.
It,
It's better than not doing anything.
and if nothing else, it's a great start.
Right. It gets you moving with a sword shaped object, roughly sword shaped object, some of these. It gets you moving and in that kind of mindset, and it gets you into the reaction speed. It gets you into it gets you
Where
used to being hit, even if
and
it's not hard.
and whether you know the terms or not, it'll get you thinking of things like measure, timing, tempo. Um, if you don't have words for it, or if you don't know what those words mean as you're getting into sword fighting, it's just distance from opponent and that kind of stuff. But it's going to get you thinking that way versus I'm just going to club somebody with this sword shaped object. And hopefully, the more you do it, the
Right.
more critically you approach it. Um, I don't think everybody's going to go out there and start reading manuals. But if you do, again, awesome. Learning things is
Right.
great.
Yeah. Yeah. We should always, no matter what you're doing, and even if it doesn't necessarily have to be manuals, right? Um, if you're if you just want to go out and hit people, then go out and hit people. Learn from people hitting people. Learn about gear, learn about your weapon, you know, learn how to do a thing more effectively or efficiently. Whatever that thing might be. It could be just going for a run or a brisk walk,
Yeah.
or whatever the case might be, and getting in better shape. But you need to always be doing something. Like I was watching. For those of you who even very lightly follow the armored combat sports, or for anyone who watched Night Fight, Paul the Barbarian has a YouTube channel, and yesterday he was doing a live stream, and he was saying that if you're not out on the Pell, hitting your Pell 100 times a day, then you're doing it wrong. If your thing is LED saber fighting, great, do it. Go train at it. Go get better at it. Go read stuff for it. Whatever it takes, just get better.
Yeah.
Push yourself.
Yeah, and definitely with some of the groups, I think most people are in it for the community, and there's nothing wrong with that. In that aspect, go out there and socialize.
Yeah.
And on the topic of people training, like Paul the Barbarian, or we know someone, Daniel Lane, who likes to
Mm.
go for runs while twirling his lightsaber.
Right.
Um, and that's his
Um,
flavor of working out and bringing
yeah.
LED saber stuff into runs.
Yeah.
So,
And people who do the full armored combat stuff, they go climb mountains in their gear. I actually know a couple LED saber guys who have done that. Um,
that's a choice.
I might, yeah, it's a choice. I'm not going to do it. Um, I've won too many bad joints for that kind of stuff. But it's a choice. If that's what you want to do, go for it. If you want to put on a fencing helmet and go for run a marathon, go for it. Have fun. Do you? Don't kill yourself, but do your thing, right? Yeah, just all of it. If you're getting into any kind of fighting, then training and just pushing yourself, getting better every day. That's what matters. Because, I would say the caliber of fighter that we have across the board for any fighting organization, from, the guys in the park with foam who just got their fifth member, or or Olympic fencing, like the caliber of fighters that we have nowadays in the world are so much better than 100 200 years ago for the sports side, right? Obviously people back then might have more experience with actual combat, and that's great, but for the sports side, that's something that we have to acknowledge, is that we're constantly getting better. The quality of fighter in TSL is so much better than it was even when I started. At TSL 2, the big international tournament they had in 2017, I want to say. Yeah, like there were some great fighters, but do I think that they would, like, the same outcomes would have, the same person would place first or second or third if they were fighting today's fighters at like TSL 5, which is coming up if it doesn't get canceled, yeah, this August. Like the caliber of fighter is getting better, but not just with fighting. Like if your thing is blacksmithing, well, the quality of blacksmiths today is better than it's been in probably the last 100 years. Because people are doing it again. There's more people doing hobbies nowadays than probably ever.
Yeah, and global communities and the internet and the
Yep.
ease to finding these resources help
Mm.
make anybody doing anything as part of a group better, I think.
Right.
Um,
And not only that, if you take like the example of, Fiore in Venice, right? If you went up and was like, "Hey, I'm just Joe Schmo off the street, and I want to learn how to sword fight," he probably would have looked at you sideways, right? Because here's a guy who's training knights and training noblemen and training these high profile individuals, and you come up just nobody. Then why is he going to spend the time? But if you go nowadays, and especially with the HEMA or I would say most HEMA schools, not all of them. There are some out there that are a little stingy with information. Some of them rightfully so, But if you're somewhere where you can't get to a HEMA school, or you don't have anything in your area, and you're not getting enough from just researching, you need someone to ask questions of, then you reach out and ask people. Because my experience, at least so far, with most of the people in HEMA is they just want everybody to get better. They're willing to help.
and with Facebook groups and stuff, it's super easy
Yep.
to do that. So I think we're pushing about an hour 30. So
Fair
I
enough.
think we covered everything we wanted to cover. Look forward sometime in the future. We'll probably do a picking your first LED saber
Yep.
video, and we plan to talk about gear, picking out your gear or the gear we use within HEMA and the lightsaber groups we're part of.
Yep.
So if you got this far and you listened to Mark and myself ramble on for the entirety of this episode, hopefully you thought it was interesting.
Hopefully.
And right. Um, so I think that's going to wrap up this episode. Thank you for tuning in.
Yep.
Thank you for sticking around. And have a
Have a good one.
Yeah, there we go. I like
Okay.
that.
Have a good one.